Hey, how's it going?
I'm okay, how are you?
Very, very good. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I am
Hey,
very,
no problem. No problem at all. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
yeah, yeah, for sure. I wasn't sure if I'd hear back from you, but I'm very grateful that I did. Um, yeah, I'm gonna keep it brief on my end with commentary, just so you have enough time to speak, because I know there's quite a few questions. Really cool seeing in your studio too, getting to interview you in your workspace. That's
Yeah, I've
very
got
exciting.
some of my synths and stuff here.
Nice. Whenever you're ready to please
Yeah.
introduce yourself and your relationship to music.
Hi, my name is Richard Jacques, and I'm a video game composer. I've been working in the industry almost 30 years. I'm a classically trained composer, and my instruments are trombone, piano, and percussion.
Wonderful. Also, I've been wondering how to pronounce your name because every
Oh, good
time I look up
question.
your last name, it's
Yeah,
always pronounced different, and I'm like, okay, I gotta wait till you
people
say
have
it.
people have different ideas. It's pronounced Jakes.
Okay, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, cool.
All right. So the next question is the one that I just added in, which is, what is Jet Set Radio Future?
Jet Set Radio Future is a futuristic rollerblading, graffiti tagging, street art, platformer, 3D exploration, amazing game for the Xbox console, developed by Smilebit team from Sega.
Perfect. All right. And then what is your relationship with Jet Set Radio Future?
My relationship with Jet Set Radio Future began after having previously worked on Jet Set Radio. I worked on Jet Set Radio when I was an in-house composer with Sega here in London in the UK, where I spent 8 years, just under 8 years, as an in-house composer with Sega, working on some of their big franchises. So I did one track for Jet Set Radio, and that track was called "Everybody Jump Around." A lot of the music was composed by Hideki Naganuma in Sega Japan, and there was some licensed music as well. So my involvement with Jet Set Radio Future began, I believe it was in late 2000 or early 2001, when my producer at Sega Europe told me that Sega Japan were going to be making a sequel, this time for the Xbox console. And they asked if I could do two new original tracks. So I composed a track called "What About the Future" and another one called "Bokfresh." And then I was also asked to remix Hideki Naganuma's track from the first Jet Set Radio game, which was called "Let Mum Sleep." So that's how it all began for me.
Awesome. Okay, next question is, how would you describe the Jet Set Radio Future fan base?
The Jet Set Radio Future fan base is an amazing group of people because the sequel, the Jet Set Radio Future game itself, is somewhat of a slightly niche but very hardcore fan base because it was a very popular game, and I think the fans have stuck with it over the years. I mean, it's 20 years old now or thereabouts, and I think they're very very passionate about the game because the gameplay goes a bit deeper than the first Jet Set Radio. The setting is much more in the future. It's a slightly darker game. So I think it has its own fan base as well as fans of both games. So yeah, wonderful selection of fans, and I love to see them digging into the various music tracks and the art style and cosplaying and making up their own sort of fan games. They're a really great bunch of people.
Awesome. Yeah, they are definitely very passionate. Somebody
Yeah,
else I interviewed recently, they described it that um, anybody who's still a fan of Jet Set Radio Future and they work on creative projects, they always put 110% into whatever they're doing. I
amazing.
was
That's
like,
so cool.
that's a good way to describe it.
Absolutely.
All right. Let's see here. Next question is, what was it like composing for Jet Set Radio Future?
What was it like composing for Jet Set Radio Future? Well, as I mentioned previously, I'd worked on the first Jet Set Radio, but I wanted to take it a little bit further because was keying in on the word future, and when I saw some of the early graphics from the game, as I mentioned, it's, you know, it is more futuristic. It's slightly darker in tone, and I really wanted to think, you know, what is futuristic music going to sound like? Well, that's the $64 million question. No one knows that, right? So I'd already heard some of the new songs that Hideki Naganuma had already written, specifically the concepts of love and a few other songs that he was working on. And by the way, most of the credit should go to him for sort of, you know, coming up with the overall style, for the overall musical style. He's you know, I met him a few times in Sega Japan. He's a great composer. I was sort of brought on just to produce some extra material, and there was some licensed music as well, as I'm sure you know. But when I first thought about the tracks, I think it was Bokfresh that I wrote first, which was a similar type of style to Everybody Jump Around that I composed for the first Jet Set Radio. So that's more on the sort of funky party breaks, sort of funky hip hop kind of vibe. Whereas What About the Future is a track that I sort of was much more experimental on, and it reflects the kind of music I was listening to at the time, and it was popular in especially a lot of underground clubs here in London that I was going to, and all the music I was listening to at that time. So it was a really great process, and you know, I was honoured to be asked back to contribute to the second soundtrack. I was just wrapping up on Headhunter as well at the time, which was another game I was working on for Sega, which had a big orchestral score. So I was just coming up to the end of that, and then I switched straight over to Jet Set Radio Future just before I left Sega, actually. So it would have been mid 2001, I think. So yeah, it's a great process, just, you know, seeing what they were doing with the game, hearing what Hideki Naganuma was working on as well. We were exchanging some emails about sort of style and mood and tone, and I had a bit of guidance from the producers at Sega Japan. But in essence, I was given pretty much a free rein to just do what I do, and you know, I wasn't sort of sent down a specific path. So I was able to, especially with What About the Future, that track, I was able to make it a lot more electronic than the others, possibly, and it's a bit more sort of futuristic breaks. So yeah, it's an absolutely fantastic process, and yeah, just a joy to be part of it.
Awesome. So two follow-up questions to that. Does that mean Jet Set Radio Future was your last game at Sega?
Yes, my last game at Sega as an in-house composer was indeed Jet Set Radio Future.
Oh, okay. And then second follow-up question to that, when you were composing those songs, did you have any specific parts in mind from the story that inspired you, like levels or characters or maps?
No, regarding where the music was going to be placed in the game, that was completely up to the designers at Sega Japan. So I didn't actually know at that time which levels and areas and parts of the story my music was actually going to be placed in. I just knew the overall vibe, and because it has the radio station with DJ Professor K, I knew that the tracks would often get interdispersed with other pieces of music. So I left that completely up to them. I just sent them some rough sketches. I think I did some kind of 30-second, 60-second demos and saying, this is what I'm working on. They said, yeah, absolutely fantastic. You know, please go ahead and finish the tracks. And then it was completely up to them. So I never knew where they appeared in the game until I played the finished version on my Xbox console. So it was very interesting for me seeing where they came up, and a lot of people say, a lot of the fan base say that What About the Future is one of the rarer tracks. So I don't know whether that means it doesn't come up too often in the game, or if it's on a sort of random time. Or I know that people were looking for it online quite hard, and I had to sort of put people in the right direction. So yeah, really interesting. But I left that side of things up to Sega Japan.
Interesting indeed. Yeah. I would just ask because I know that they did a lot of Grand Royal tracks specifically for the sewer levels. And so I wasn't sure if they
Ah,
had that in mind for your tracks at all. But all
interesting.
right. All right. So next question is going to be what directions were you given by the development team?
I was basically given a small amount of direction by the team. They didn't want to kind of make me too constricted as a composer, which is always the best thing to do in especially in the video game industry. So they just gave me some basic guidelines, you know, make sure it's on point with the overall creative style and creative vision for the game. I knew that already from having worked on Jet Set Radio, so I was completely into that. The emphasis was on future. You know, they said it's we're taking on a more futuristic tone with the game. So again, that's one of the reasons why I went a bit more electronic with one of my tracks. And apart from that, as long as it was kind of upbeat and it had a good pace to it and a good feel, they let me just go for it, which was absolutely fantastic. And you know, that's how I like to work. I like to deliver what the team want. Of course, that's my role as a composer, but also having some creative freedom is where a team gets the best out of their composer, and that I think that works across the board.
Definitely, and it seems like a lot of the staff who worked on that game had a lot of creative freedom, which is very interesting to see how it all meshed together.
Yeah,
Yeah.
certainly, especially as far as I know, right at the beginning of the development of Jet Set Radio, you know, the art director was, you know, I think it's his idea. They were just playing around and came up with the cell shading technique, and they didn't really know what they were building. They just came up with the sort of technique and the graphical look, and they were all into street culture and things like that. And I think they built the game around that. That's as far as I know, anyway.
Yeah, which is crazy because like cell shading now is like having its time in the sun.
Yeah, I
It's
know.
really cool.
Yeah, lots of games.
Alrighty, so next question is going to be what differed in your approach towards composing for Jet Set Radio Future versus Jet Set Radio?
Um, I would say my difference in composing to Jet Set Radio Future versus Jet Set Radio, um, well, it depends on the track. I had a similar composition approach in the sense that I was using, I mean, let's look at the core between both games. I was using a lot of old school break beats, so you know, funky breaks from back in the 70s. I mean, they're all licensed from official sample libraries, but that was the vibe I was going for. So that was one of the core elements that ran through both games for me. So my track, Bok Fresh on Jet Set Radio Future, again, that's similar to the first Jet Set Radio. So it's kind of funky breaks, it's party breaks, it's sort of, it's got hip hop breaks, but it's also got funky breaks. It's got horn section in. It's got crazy vocals. It's got crazy raps and sort of those kind of effects. I also did a lot of the scratching myself, which I'm not the best scratch DJ, but I used to do a lot of it when I was a lot younger, and I had to edit a lot of it together. But that is actually me scratching on those tracks, just in case people were wondering. And then especially, I mean, working on the remix for Let Mum Sleep, which was composed by Hideki Naganuma. I mean, that's one of my favorite tracks in the whole series because it just, to me, set the tone right from the beginning, from the first Jet Set Radio. And I love that track. So it was a real honor to get the samples from Hideki, and I was able to create my own version of that, but keeping it faithful to his original. But then, you know, as I said, What About the Future is a very different track because there's not that many similarities with how I composed that versus the other tracks from both from both games. What About the Future is using a lot more electronic drums. So I was using lots of different drum machines, analog drum machines from the 80s. I was using 909s, 606s, 303s, a lot of Roland gear, which I love. I have a lot of Roland hardware analog synths, vintage synths from the 80s. So that already gives it a different sound. It was a bit faster. Some of the other tracks I wrote are slightly more on a laid back groove. They still have pace to them, but What About the Future is definitely faster. I think it's about, off the top of my head, it's around 130, 135 BPM. So you've got at least 10 BPM faster than some of my other tracks. And its emphasis is more on the actual break and breakbeat music in those days, and all the things I was listening to. I mean, there's lots of terms for them. You could call it just breakbeat, you can call it new school breaks, you could call it a whole load of names. I mean, futuristic breaks was a thing, electro breaks was a name that came about 5 years later. And a very funny anecdote, there's a thread somewhere on YouTube I think on this particular track, on what about the future, where there's a whole discussion about how this track was like inventing breakbeat, and inventing dubstep. My apologies. There is no way I'm claiming I invented dubstep, just for the record. But it's quite interesting because these kind of sounds that I was using that were around at that time were probably around 2 to 3 years before dubstep really started, or maybe 5 years. So it's kind of, I always find it interesting how subgenres of music, especially electronic music, kind of, come from different places and get molded together, and then somebody somewhere gives them a new name. So that's all quite interesting. But yeah, what about the future? A lot more electronic, faster tempo, and a bit more aggressive, I would say. Not in a particularly heavy way, but it's certainly going to a place that I wanted to take that track to make it more futuristic. There's a couple of remixes that fans have done online, and they're absolutely fantastic. I love them all. So yeah, it's obviously, it's inspired people to sort of take it to another level again, which is great.
Definitely, and I would say that track, if the game didn't have that track, the game wouldn't feel as futuristic. So,
Oh,
it's
really? That's
yeah,
interesting.
like, honestly, especially, like, just editing a lot of footage for the documentary and putting together little bits and clips with that song as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really sets the tone and makes it feel like it kinda gives, like, the game some weight to it in terms
Yeah.
of just making it feel a little bit heavy, because like you're saying, it's a little dark.
Mm. Bit
But
more
yeah,
edgy.
yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Um, that said, did you have any, legal restraints with, like, what samples you could use for those songs?
No, regarding any samples I used, they were all off. They were all taken from licensed sample CDs. Which, I mean, back in the day, I'm not sure if the company's still going, but there was a very popular sample library manufacturer called Zero G, and a lot of them came from those. So we're talking, this company was especially big around the mid to late 90s and early 2000s. So a lot of jungle and drum and bass, you will hear samples taken from those sample CDs. And there's even some big like dance hits. I can't think off the top of my head, but even some of the main vocal hooks are all off these sample CDs. So it was all taken using Akai hardware samplers. So at the time, I had two Akai S3200 XL samplers with a little dot matrix screen, and we used to, now it's easy on computer, but making your drum loop in an Akai sampler, and we used to edit the waveform on this little dot matrix screen. And in a way, that was part of the fun because you're constantly triggering the sample. That's why every enter key on the numerical keypad is always really worn, because everyone's just keep hammering it for the drum loop. But it was a really fun way of doing things. But now everything's legally compliant, and I mangled loads of sounds and edited stuff, and I made some of my own sounds, and even the vocoded voice on that song is my voice. So that's me saying what about the future through a vocoder and a microphone.
Wow, that's interesting. I didn't know that. I was actually wondering where that came from.
Yeah, that's me in a SM57 microphone, and there's a hardware vocoder which I've still got somewhere called a PCP330, I think, vocoder. It's a pink and silver rack mount unit, and it gives a really, really cool sound. In my opinion, much better than plugins, software plugins. So yeah, this piece of equipment, the PCP330 vocoder, was the piece of equipment I used to make the sound What About the Future.
Nice. Yeah, it definitely added a lot of texture to to your voice.
Yeah.
In terms of musicians, who were your biggest inspirations when composing for the Jet Set Radio series?
Oh, that's a great question. So regarding my influences, I mean, this goes back to when I was studying and growing up as a kid. The interesting thing about my kind of studying and my upbringing and my childhood in the UK and in London, I was studying classical music at the time. So I was playing trombone in symphony orchestras. So I was playing composers such as Stravinsky, Shostakovich, Debussy. I was learning the piano, and I was learning percussion as well. So orchestral percussion and drum kit and Latin percussion. So that was already forming part of my style. even going back to the age of sort of 10, I actually started writing music when I was about 10 or 11. I had a home computer and I started messing around. But then at the same time, growing up, around this particular time of sort of age 10 or 11, hip hop was just becoming really big in the UK. So going back to, I've got a funny story. When I was about 12 years old, I think, I saw Ice-T, the rapper, at a really small sports centre in a very small part of the UK, which no one's ever heard of. And this was before Ice-T was released his Power album and is now a huge music and movie star. So it was around that time when sort of, the beginnings of hip hop was just on, it's coming out of the breakdance era. Hip hop was right on the cusp. And, the guys I was hanging out with and growing up with, we were listening to artists like Public Enemy, Boogie Down Productions, KRS-One, Run DMC, Big Daddy Kane. I've still got a whole shelf full of vinyl from this era. And what was interesting about it, I didn't realize right at that point in time that all the breakbeats they were using were from records from the 70s, James Brown, etc., etc. And they would go out and hunt out these amazing breaks and then MC over the top of them. They weren't in a huge recording studio with a band. It was just an MC and a DJ. And I remember thinking about that when I was probably about 13 or 14, and then I made the connection. I think, well, hang on a minute, that breaks from that James Brown track, and that break is from another artist, whatever. So then I started listening to a lot of 70s music, and I listened to a lot of funk and disco and things like that. And I used to memorize which hip hop break was from which funk song, and you sort of have a little memory. And then as I grew up and I started getting more equipment, I got more into electronic music. So everything from The Prodigy is a big favorite of mine. There was an artist called General Midi that I was listening to a lot. The early days of BT, when he was doing more breaks, I think he's doing more trance now, but when he was big on the break scene, and a lot of underground artists that were just doing breaks, and things, Adam Freeland, people like that, freestylers, much later on. But it was kind of a parallel education of doing straight traditional classical music for my education, and then listening to all this kind of cool hip hop and funk and soul and jazz and electronic music in my spare time. And in a way, those two strands of my upbringing have sort of played a big part in my compositional style, working in the video games industry, not only in Jet Set Radio Future, but kind of across the board. You can hear little flavors of it here and there depending on what kind of game I'm working on. Really lucky to have that kind of background though. It was really good times growing up.
Yeah, especially recently you've been doing a lot more like scores and classical style music, right?
Yeah, a lot of scores. That seems to be what I'm known for now, and that's something I'd always wanted to do. And that's one of the reasons why I sort of left Sega to focus more on that. But I still get to work on a few other projects, and I may work on some side projects with more along the lines of Jet Set Radio, let's say. I've got a few ideas that I'd like to pursue in the future. But the orchestral scoring is something I really, really do enjoy. But I also like beats, I like electronica. So it's nice to kind of mix it up a bit.
All right, next question is going to be Bach Fresh is a cult classic. What inspired the making of it?
I suppose I took a lot of inspiration from what Hideki Naganuma was already doing, because he has a wonderful mixture of sort of funk and hip hop and soul, and he's definitely got a sense of humor. I love his tracks because they're so perfect for the game, but they also have a little element of, I mean, maybe he would disagree, but I can hear a little element of sort of humor about it as well. So it makes it fun. It makes it a really great sense of fun playing the game with those tracks. So for Bokfresh, I took a similar approach. There's some quite funny samples in there, which you may not think would go together when you start picking them out, and then you start forming the track. And I've got lots of crazy scratching in there as well, once again. So yeah, those were the kind of ideas. Because when I heard what he was doing on Concepts of Love, that was seemed to me faster in tempo than a few of the tracks from the first Jet Set Radio. So again, I sort of made that a bit more up tempo, trying to follow the progression of what both the game team and what Naganuma-san was doing, and trying to push the envelope a bit. So that was the main kind of inspiration behind it.
Gotcha. And then, what does the title Bachfresh mean to you?
It's just a really kind of arbitrary name. There is a funny story behind it. So Bok, B-O-K, there's a friend of mine going back 25 years that used to say it a lot, and as a sort of exclamation. It's not a curse word or anything. And I asked him about it, and he said that it was from a really old 2D fighting game, I think on the SNK or the Neo Geo or something. It could have been King of Fighters or something. I don't remember. It's a very, very, very old fighting game. And apparently one of the speech bubbles when the player did the move, instead of like bam or something, said bok. Now, I don't know how true this is. It sounds like it's quite an obscure Japanese fighting game. And then in the UK and probably in the US as well, there's a sneaker company called Boxfresh. So, and I had a pair of Boxfresh, so I just put them together. It's that simple. It just sounded right for the game, for the era that we were in. It kind of sounded a bit urban, a bit street art. So I thought, why not?
Definitely. And then when composing, what about the future? Did you envision a certain type of future? If so, what did it consist of?
I was, in terms of thinking about what about the future, I was envisaging what kind of sound would be in a piece of music. And again, thinking about the music I was listening to and the sort of more underground style of breakbeats and new school breaks and electronic music at the time, I was trying to take that a bit further. So there used to be a night every Friday in London. We used to go to this club called it was a night called Air, and it was put on at a club called Rhythm Factory. And then there's another really famous club called Fabric, which I think's closed down now. But those two clubs in particular were playing all this kind of underground electronic breakbeat, and I was absolutely loving it at the time. And me and my friends would always go and hang out there and listen to this amazing music. And it was kind of a bit hypnotic as well. It was quite repetitive, but also quite hypnotic because it had very heavy breaks, very heavy both drum machines and old school breakbeats as well, and this kind of filter tweaking, very low bass synths with a big filter suite which gives you that kind of wow, and it's really hypnotic to dance to. And they had lasers and all the stuff in the clubs. So I was thinking a lot about that kind of experience that I was having at the time, at the age that I was in these amazing sort of underground clubs in London, and I wanted to just take that a bit further, whilst making it still appropriate for the game. It couldn't be so dark that it didn't fit with the game, but I wanted to kind of push it a bit further. I was also on the drum programming, I was also using a few techniques that I learned from making some drum and bass and some jungle. So the beats in What About the Future, they are quite regular, but there's a little kind of skippy fill every 4 bars ish especially on the snare and the kick, and there's a lot of interplay, so it keeps your interest. And then a lot of the sort of filtered bass synths and stuff that they were created using some I don't think I've got it to hand, but some old analog synths from the 80s, and I processed them quite heavily to make them quite aggressive and things like that. So I was always thinking about just futuristic, hypnotic, heavy beats. Those kind of elements was always what I was thinking about.
Awesome. All right. And the next question is going to be Let Mom Sleep, No Sleep Remix truly embodies the overall spirit of Jet Set Radio Future, from the frequent but broken sirens in the opening to the old timey samples, group vocals, and strategic use of bass throughout. What inspired your futuristic take on this funky classic?
Well, when I was working on the remix for Let Mom Sleep, again, just it's such a great track. I really love that track. So I was honored that Naganuma-san wanted me to remix it. And I thought, well, it's so good. How do I, when you remix something, it's not about making it better. It's about it maybe extending the life or taking it in a slightly different route. I think it's what a lot of people don't understand. You're giving your music to someone else and say, go nuts, have fun. I want to hear what your style is. And I do that with some of my songs, that people have remixed my music, and that's why I choose them as a remixer. I say, go crazy and do your thing. So I wanted it. I think it's a little bit faster in tempo than the original. Not too much. I'm not taking too much away from it, but I think it's a little bit faster. It's a little bit more edgier. So I added a lot more beats and kind of made them a lot more accented on, I can't remember which beats of the bar, but it's a bit heavy. I didn't want to make it too heavy, but yeah, I wanted to make the bass kind of a bit heavier and a bit more energetic, because that's what the rest of the tracks that Naganuma-san was composing for Jet Set Radio Future, he was already going more in a faster, sort of slightly more punchier, more energy into the tracks. And so I was already listening to what he was working on, and I thought, right, let's make sure it's got plenty of energy in there. So I wanted to be faithful to the original, but sort of push it a bit harder, a bit more energy. And like you said, with the sirens, that's basically transform scratching, and I sort of wanted to get that element in there. And I think I used about 3 or 4 different bass synths all put together, and made it really, really fat and really big in the bottom end, and a lot harder and busier in the drum patterns as well, but keeping the original samples thrown in so that it sounds like the same track, but it's it's a little bit different.
It sounds a lot like the spirit of the game overall, how it's kind of like a remix of the first game, pretty
Yes,
much.
that's a very good point. Very good comparison.
All right, so what were the challenges you encountered while working on these projects, if any?
None. I didn't encounter any challenges at all. I enjoyed
Nice.
every second.
That's awesome. I feel like not a lot of people could say that. There weren't like any like super tight deadlines or anything?
No.
No?
No, I mean,
Wow.
it might be different for the game team, because and for Naganuma-san, because I don't know how many tracks he wrote, but quite a few.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably 10, 15, 20 or something. And he might have been involved with sound design, I'm not sure, but I'm imagining he was very busy. But the team in Sega Japan knew that I had to finish working on Headhunter, which was the project I was just finishing, and that had a very strict deadline. So I said to them, as soon as I finish mixing the score for Headhunter, which I think I finished in about May or June of 2001, because we recorded Headhunter at Abbey Road Studios in January 2001. And then I think around March or April time, my producer said to me, would you be able to do 3 tracks for Jet Set Radio Future? And I said, yes, no problem, but I need to finish Headhunter first, because the release date of Headhunter was earlier than the release date of Jet Set Radio Future. So I immediately finished Headhunter, and then I spent maybe 3 weeks or something on Jet Set Radio Future. It wasn't long. And I remember I sent the mixes over, I think in August 2001. And I forget the exact release date of the game, but it was pretty soon after the Xbox was released, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it was like February 2002, I think, something like that.
Ah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, so the next question is going to be, has your experience composing for Jet Set Radio and Jet Set Radio Future influenced or inspired you as a music composer? If so, how?
Yeah, I guess it has. I learned a lot working on both those games. It was a very natural fit for me as a composer, because, as I sort of explained about my background, it's just a genre that I know, and street art is something I'm personally interested in. One of my very good friends is a huge street artist in the UK. Growing up with hip hop, I actually met DJ Grandmaster Flash, the godfather of scratching. He came to my studio a couple of years ago, so I've got a nice picture with me and Grandmaster Flash. It's always been part of my DNA as a music fan. Those kind of years when you're growing up as a kid and a teenager, they're your formative years. They almost decide what music you're going to listen to for the rest of your life, because somehow you grab onto, whether it's rock or hip hop or whatever it is, somehow in those years, those kind of 4 or 5 years, they're your formative years, and that will almost influence what you're interested in for the rest of your life. So that was definitely the key to me as well, as a person and as a composer. And I think working on both games was such a pleasure for me, because I was able to tap into all this knowledge that I had as a music lover, but not having written that kind of music before, but I knew exactly what to do and where to go and how to create all these sounds. So, getting paid for doing that is just a dream come. That's living the dream, literally, right there. And then since then, yeah, I've obviously done a lot of different styles of music, as we were talking about earlier, done a lot of orchestral scores, etc. But whenever it comes to sort of drum programming and beats, there was another game I worked on at Sega called Metropolis Street Racer, which was before Headhunter and before Jet Set Radio, and that had a lot of different styles of music in. So I was doing some drum and bass and some electronica and things like that. And I love writing in those styles, and I'd like to do some more of that in the future. And it's quite interesting for me as a composer, because I have sort of different sets of fans from my orchestral scores, and then there's a whole section of Jet Set Radio fans, and then other Sega projects I've done in the past as well. And a lot of comments I read about Jet Set Radio and Jet Set Radio Futures, people seem to like my drum programming and all the beats, and that's a real compliment, and I'm really grateful to hearing that from people's comments, because that's something I do take care over, because it's a real fundamental part of the track. But I always try and make them interesting, and I think the key word would be energy. I always put energy into my music, regardless of what musical style I'm working in. Most of the things I write have a lot of energy, and even if it's an orchestral score or whatever, something else, a lot of energy.
Definitely. Yeah, you have a lot of different fans for different reasons.
Yep.
All right. So then how closely did you work with and discuss music with other composers on the game, if at all?
Not really at all. I would have a few email discussions with Naganuma-san, but I was the only guy in Europe, as far as I know, working on the project. I know that Sega America, they also licensed some extra music, and I think they might have had a couple of custom songs as well. I'm not sure. But in Europe, I was the only composer working on both Jet Set Radio and Jet Set Radio Future. So I would have discussions with my producer in London, who was Japanese, and he would speak Japanese to the team in case we need anything translating. And Naganuma-san, his English is great, so we would just have a few emails. But he was very busy, and they really trusted me, which was great. I understood the project, the concept, the style, the vibe, the feel, the mood. So it was amazing that they just kind of said, yeah, just do your thing. So that's what I did. So no, not too much contact, just some sort of formalities and some, admin and things like that. But stylistically, I think I could see exactly what it needed right from the get-go.
Definitely. And then if you could, who is Hideki Naganuma?
Hideki Naganuma is the composer of the majority of Sega's Jet Set Radio and Jet Set Radio Future. I'm not sure if he's still in-house, but he was an in-house composer with Sega Japan throughout the 90s and 2000s. I met him on a number of occasions. He's a terrific guy, terrific composer, and I think he now has the online moniker of, what does he call himself? Funky Uncle, I think he calls himself, which is definitely very appropriate. So if he's listening, hi Naganuma-san.
Just out of curiosity, did you happen to listen to Parliament Funkadelic at all?
Yes, I did, and I actually met George Clinton at the Cannes Film Festival one year, and he was just an absolute icon. But yeah, Parliament Funkadelic, I mean, just incredible. I also had the pleasure of meeting Nile Rodgers from Chic, and a lot of their early records were getting used on hip hop stuff, especially Good Times. That was, I mean, a big record on a lot of early hip hop songs. So meeting those legends that would have created the originals, and then their music getting used with hip hop, and then giving them a new lease of life, because discovering, I wouldn't have known about Chic Good Times if I hadn't have known the hip hop track that sampled it. So
Yeah, definitely.
it's a
Yeah,
really good way of joining the dots, if you like.
For sure, yeah, definitely. Yeah, the more research I do on this game, the more I can see a lot of direct inspiration specifically from Parliament Funkadelic.
Oh yeah,
Even just with like character design and stuff, because they have so much like of their own lore and everything.
I mean,
Yeah,
Professor
it's
K even looks a bit like George Clinton, you know.
yeah, yeah. Now that you mentioned it, I didn't think about that.
Yeah, I made
Yeah.
that connection with George's dreads, and yeah. Maybe that's just me making the connection that's not there, but
No, yeah, yeah, that makes sense because like there's even some characters in the game that look almost like their costumes look almost identical to some characters that Parliament Funkadelic came up with,
yeah, because that
which
was
yeah.
Parliament Funkadelic. The show was such a huge part of their act. The spaceship and all that kind of stuff, and I just loved watching those videos. And yeah, their stage presence and their act was such a big part of the show that the costumes they came up with were just absolutely amazing, absolutely
Yeah,
amazing.
definitely. So I ended up doing like I have a whole I don't know, at least like 5, 6 minutes in the documentary specifically covering Parliament Funkadelic, and we even
Amazing,
go over like the spaceship performance and everything. So
super
yeah, if
amazing.
you happen to have any commentary on that, feel free. But it's
Yeah, I mean, not really. Apart from they're an amazing band, and I love listening to Parliament Funkadelic. I love their tracks. That must have influenced my style as well, and I know they've been sampled into hip hop records as well. So another big influencing factor.
awesome. All right. So then next question is going to be in what ways do you think funk inspired the making of Jet Set Radio Future?
I think funk inspired Jets Radio Future in a number of ways. Partially the sound you get from this funky beat from 70s records, 60s and 70s records originally, just instills a kind of groove in the listener or the gamer that is second to none. I think what I love about that kind of music is it's kind of chilled, and it gets you dancing. There's no the people aren't aggressive to one another. They're just kind of grooving, and they in the game they really got that with just the dances that the characters do. And I thought that was just so perfect, the way they represent that, and the art style, and the way the characters, even the way they skate, the baggy clothes. There's so much crossover, which I think funk music as a genre in itself has inspired the game, not just the soundtrack of the game, which was obviously inspired by funk music, but the entire genre. And of course, with hip hop in the middle and graffiti art as well, which it derives itself from back in the sort of early hip hop and then the funk days. You can all kind of root it back to those funk days if you really sort of look at the trajectory of it. So I think it was a huge influence on the game.
And then that leads me to the next question. In what ways do you think hip hop culture inspired the making of Jet Set Radio Future?
Well, hip hop culture was definitely a big influence on Jet Set Radio Future. I can say that with a degree of authority, because when I was a kid, I was a very bad street artist, not on any illegal buildings, I will say, but on big canvases. A lot of my friends were getting into it. We were learning about, coming out the breakdance era into the hip hop era. The clothing, I had all the big sneakers, big trainers, the baggy clothes. My one of my friends that I grew up with had some turntables when I think he was about 13, so we were always around at his house playing records and things like that. So I knew the culture. I grew up with the culture as it was happening, and I can safely say that the hip hop culture, encompassing all those things. Not just the music, but in the music itself, the rappers, the scratching, the playing of break beats and MCs rapping over the top, the street art, the graffiti tagging. It wasn't really gangs. I mean, there were gangs, but not in a particularly bad way. I mean, I was in a sort of gang, but it was just a bunch of bunch of guys I used to hang around with. Really, there was nothing sinister about it. We used to have dance battles and MC battles and DJ battles, which was kind of funny being a white middle class kid from the UK, but that's what everyone was doing. That was the time. This was really happening. It was right on the cusp of that, and I loved being around that time. So yeah, definitely hip hop culture, a big part of the influence of Jet Set Radio Future, without a doubt.
And this question just popped up on the top of my head because I was unaware of your love for street art and your experience with it. Did that have any influence on like your approach towards working on this game?
Yes, definitely. So I would check out a UK street artist called Inkie, Inkie. I won't tell too much about him. Not that he's not that he's anonymous, but he actually used to work at Sega a long time ago, and that's how I know him. And he's one of the premier street artists in the world now. So I check out Inkie's work. I used to see him doing his art at the weekend. So we were both working at Sega, and then he would be doing a festival, and he would get hired by, big companies to do these huge pieces. And I used to just go and watch him do them from beginning. I mean, he's an incredible artist. So that had a big influence. And I remember when I left Sega on my last day, he did something on the computer for me, but it was a New York street scene, and he did my name on the back of some big van, and he did it on a tablet, I think. But that is really cool, and I've got that still on my wall. And yeah, his artwork's amazing. So I've always loved that kind of style, and I've got lots of street art in my house actually. So yeah, some reason it kind of all comes from the same point, really, same influences. And yeah, big fan of street art. Yeah.
So he was a street artist and he worked at Sega. Did he have it? But he didn't have any part with Jet Set Radio or Jet Set Radio Future.
Mm, the only thing maybe, and I don't know this, but I think if you look into it yes, I think actually now you mention it, I think he made some of the tags on the
Oh,
graffiti
okay.
tags, especially on Jet Set Radio Future, because I think there's an Inky tag maybe in the game. I
It
might
sounds familiar.
I
Yeah.
might be wrong, but I would certainly look into it, because I know he was working sort of in the marketing department. So there may well be an Inky tag actually in the game, especially in the second game in Jet Set Radio Future. It's something that I can't actually remember, I'll be honest, but certainly look into it.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. All right. Next question then is going to be is there anything we don't know about the music of Jet Set Radio and or Future? Collaborations that almost happened, cutting room floor music, tracks the team wanted to license that you could tell us about.
Um, well, in terms of licensed tracks, that is something that I wasn't involved with, but I know that it has sort of, I wouldn't say caused issues, but that's why there are lots of different versions of the game, especially the first game. So on Jet Set Radio, Sega Japan picked their tracks, and then I believe that Sega Europe, we added another 3, and I helped select them with a friend of mine. So there was 3 exclusives just for the European release of the game, and then Sega America also picked some extra tracks, but I don't think they used the tracks we used in Europe, because they had Rob Zombie and a few other tracks on the US release of the first Jet Set Radio game. So there's kind of 3 slightly different playlists, but they all contain the same core tracks. So Hideki Naganuma's tracks and my tracks are in all 3 versions. With Jet Set Radio Future, I'm not sure if there were different versions. I think it was slightly more uniform, but there's every possibility that Sega America might have wanted something different for the North American territory. I think the different Sega territories were trying to tailor it specifically to make sure the music taste was catered for in their territory, which makes sense, but without ruining the overall feel and vibe of the soundtrack and of the game as well. So if there's any reasons why, I mean, there's loads of theories why Jet Set Radio Future was never re-released. I don't know whether it was to do with music licensing. I imagine that could have been fixed very easily, because an artist would normally license for a set period of time. and then they could just relicense. I'm guessing it was to do with what the game teams were doing, and that's something I don't know anything about at all. I know there's lots of, I wouldn't say conspiracy theories, but lots of theories of why they never re-released the game, because it's so popular and it has a huge cult following. Jet Set Radio Future soundtrack had a musical philosophy. What would it be? That is a really tough question. I would say, just from my own perspective, more as a listener and as a gamer than a composer, I would say the philosophy behind it is kind of exploration, exploring oneself as much as what's happening in the environment around you. And the reason I say that is for a number of factors. Firstly, because the environments in the game seem to be a lot bigger and a lot more expansive than the first game, and there are so many different paths you can take. But also, as you're playing the game, you're taking in so much of the surrounding environments, whether it's shop fronts, apartment blocks, these little kind of side alleys, these underground passages. Those kind of things are just totally unique. And the whole kind of futuristic Tokyoto type thing, that's something that just is so unique to the game. So I think those are the philosophies behind it, but I guess the designers would be the people to really speak to about that. But that's what I get from it as a gamer and as a composer.
And then, what would some of your favorite aspects of the game be, just as a gamer yourself, not necessarily a composer?
Different aspects of the game that I love. I love rail grinding. I just love grinding rails. I could do that all day, every day. Tagging as well, especially the big tags. But yeah, for some reason, just grinding rails that's what I'm all about.
Did you ever use the custom graffiti maker in there?
Yeah, I
To
did
make your own?
actually. I did actually use the custom graffiti maker on the Xbox, and I think on the Dreamcast as well, actually. And yeah, made some of my own tags. They're not the best, but they're personal.
Yeah, definitely.
And
Yeah.
it's a great feature. I mean, I love having the ability to be able to do that. That's just so cool.
Especially because it's like so much of the game is about individuality, and I feel like just giving that one specific tool just kind of underlines that whole theme. But
Definitely,
yeah.
yeah.
All right. So next question is going to be, if Sega invited you to be featured on the original soundtrack of a new Jet Set Radio game, what would you say?
If Sega asked me, I'll do that again. If Sega invited me to be on a new Jet Set Radio soundtrack, what would I say? I would say, when do I start?
What and then that leads me to the next question, which is, Jet Set Radio Future takes place in 2024. Now that it is the future, what do you think the soundtrack for a new Jet Set Radio game would sound like?
In terms of what a new Jet Set Radio Future game would sound like, as you quite rightly said, we're already in 2022 and Jet Set Future is set in 2024. I guess the principles would be the same in terms of thinking about what the future would sound like. And it would depend on a lot of influences of where music is right now. Music as a whole has just kind of become so disparate now. Now we've got streaming and internet radio and YouTube, etc., etc. There are probably some incredible acts and artists there that would be a perfect fit for the game, or even a perfect inspiration to the composers behind the game. But it's so difficult to find them, because it's just, the pop scene is still doing the pop thing and the rock thing and the country and whatever. I guess from my point of view, I would take a similar approach where I would think, okay, what would people be listening to in, let's say, 2040? And I would think, well, I'd look at the technology and I think, well, it might be a bit more crazy with the synths, or using, they might even be using their version of samples from, let's say, the 90s. The 2040s might be sampling 90s records, and you might be going back to 90s pop, that kind of relationship. It would be a question of, what would people be listening to, how would it sound, and then trying to create something even more futuristic than Jet Set Radio Future, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I was wondering that too. I was like, would they be sampling from the 90s or the 2000s?
Yeah,
There's a lot
I
of
don't know.
material there.
Yeah, it's not. I don't know. I mean, if you look at a band like someone like Chromeo, for example, like their kind of stuff would be very, very appropriate. And
Yeah.
even though they're quite a modern band, their influences are mostly 80s.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, I could definitely see that. I could see a lot of 80s, 90s influence in anyone. Um,
Yeah.
any last comments about Jet Set Radio Future or last words for the fan base?
Just wanted to say that I had a fantastic time working on Jet Set Radio Future. So thank you to all my friends at Sega for the opportunity. And big shout out to all the Jet Set Radio Future fans. Great bunch of people I love all the people digging into stuff and researching stuff. And yeah, thanks for listening to my music.
And would you have any tips or advice for any aspiring game composers?
Tips for aspiring game composers. Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a very competitive business now. Everybody wants to be a video game composer, but the best things to do are focus on the style of music that you like composing and that you're good at. There's no point in doing, epic orchestral if you're really good at hip hop, because there's loads of epic orchestral guys around. But just try and focus on, what is your own creative voice? What's your musical voice? Don't get too bogged down in, if you're going to study and go to music school and do orchestral music, that's great, and that's definitely the path for that kind of music, in my opinion. But if you're a guitar player or you're a DJ, just focusing on honing your skills for that. Breaking into the industry is quite hard, I won't lie, but the best thing is to just meet people both online and in person. Think about if someone's running a game jam and just making a small game over a weekend or a summer break or something. Get involved. If you can do a bit of sound design as well, that would help. Even if it's not your main thing, just to help get some audio into the game, you'll be really helping out game developers. Go to conferences, conventions, meet people, and maybe start looking at some indie projects and things like that. That's probably the best advice I can give. And just remember, it's a sort of people industry, so it's good to meet people. Don't kind of hassle people too much. If if you email someone, they don't respond, that's fine. I get over 200 emails a day. I don't have time to do anything, but to keep in touch with them maybe once every 6 months, once every 4 months, and just say hey and tell them what you've been up to and what music you've been writing. Yeah, just be cool, be relaxed. Good to be a good person in games, and just yeah, good luck with it.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I'm really excited to incorporate this in the documentary.
No
It
problem.
it started off as a video essay, and then the more I was working on it and the more I got feedback on it, I was like, okay, I need to tailor this to be an actual documentary to educate people who have no idea what this game is. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's
No,
gonna be
very
very
thorough.
insightful with
Yeah.
all of your advice and just like all your insight and everything. So thank you so much again.